Welcome, everybody, and we're gradually letting people into the Zoom and out of the waiting room, and really appreciate everybody joining us. I am very excited to be joined today by New York Times columnist Nick Kristof. We're going to be engaging in a one-on-one conversation on a wide range of topics because there is no shortage of what to talk about these days. There'll be a Q&A feature that all of you are very familiar with at this point at the bottom of your screen, so you can ask any questions you like there. I'll try to get to as many of them as possible. We're also going to be recording this conversation, and it'll be available to rewatch and to share on all sorts of different media, including our YouTube channel. And I think Eliza's going to share a link to our YouTube channel in the chat. You all are undoubtedly familiar with Nick Kristof, who explains the large turnout today. He's been writing and involved in journalism for nearly 40 years now at the New York Times, and he has been a reporter, a foreign correspondent, a bureau chief, columnist, and he is really one of the leading journalists who gets out there face-to-face to bring to us first-person reporting from the humanitarian crises around the world, from war zones. He's a two-time Pulitzer Prize winner, and most recently, I had the chance to chat with Nick in a conversation about his memoir, which we're also going to put a link into the chat, Chasing Hope, A Reporter's Life. And some of you may have joined us for that conversation. It was absolutely terrific. And, you know, Nick, you're just one of my heroes. Wherever there is injustice in the world, you will be there reporting on it. And there's no shortage of those stories today. And we're really glad that you're here. Nick, I want to start with a topic that is probably closest to the heart of folks involved in J Street, which is really what is happening on the ground right now in the Middle East. And you happen to have been there a few weeks back and wrote a series of columns, which is actually what led us to reach out to you in the first place for this conversation. So as we get started and begin to go through the whole litany of things happening around the world, what was different for you on this visit to Israel and the West Bank and the broader Middle East?
Well, first of all, Jeremy, just thank you for having me on, and thank you to all of these folks joining the conversation. You know, it really is kind of a dispiriting time around the world. My trip to the Middle East was pretty dispiriting, but I do find it uplifting that there are so many folks in J Street who are, you know, pushing for better outcomes on this issue and others. So, so keep the faith, and thank you for inspiring me, both Jeremy and everybody else. So as for that Middle East trip, you know, it was less inspiring, shall we say. You know, in a couple of ways. It was just striking also, frankly, the degree to which there is a lot less interest in what is happening in either Gaza or the West Bank than there was. I did a Gaza piece. I'm not able to get into Gaza, but, you know, I talked to folks who are there, and you know, you read it, Jeremy, but I don't think a lot of others did it. People have really kind of tuned out, I think, of Gaza. I think that Prime Minister Netanyahu thinks that he has a much freer reign to get away with things there, and I think that as a result is showing a lot less restraint. President Trump's call for, in effect, ethnic cleansing of Gaza, I think, has further amplified the sense in Israel that they can do a lot of things. And it's really driven, I think, by, you know, by Netanyahu's domestic politics. And likewise, in the West Bank, you know, I've been visiting the West Bank since 1982, and it just... You know, what I focused on this time was what I called and what human rights groups like B'Tselem have called the Gazification of the West Bank. So applying the kind of military toolbox from Gaza to, in particular, the refugee camps in the West Bank. And you know, I think, Jeremy, the thing that really struck me was the way this is cyclical. And in the Tulkarm refugee camp, beside this huge area that was destroyed where people could not go, a no-go area, I talked to a 12-year-old boy whose home had been destroyed, a 12-year-old Palestinian boy, and we were chatting, and I asked him what he wanted to be when he grew up, and he said he wanted to be a fighter for Hamas. It just you just you just feel that extremists on each side are fueling extremism on the other, and boy, I wish we could break that cycle.
Yeah. No, I'd say it's really chilling, and you're 100% right about the lack of attention because there's just so much else on everybody's radar right now. A year and a half ago when the war broke out and this became the centerpiece of activism, and college campuses were really on fire because of this issue. Now it's almost impossible to know where to focus because there's so much going on. And I think it does mean that things are able to go under the radar. And I think Netanyahu is definitely counting on that. You had a chance, I think, to talk with Ehud Barak. You reported on a little bit. What was his take? The former Prime Minister of Israel, Ehud Barak. Um, does he see a path out of this from your discussions with him?
So I like to speak to Prime Minister Barak because he not only, is a very smart politician, but of course before that he was a general and the chief of the general staff, and so he really knows military matters. And he emphasized on the military side that that at this point in Gaza, what they should do is do a deal to get the hostages back, and that is doable, and that the marginal gain of further pulverizing Gaza is not going to be helpful for Israel's strategic objectives. And boy, it's just going to put the hostages at further risk. And in the West Bank, he was emphasizing on the political side the degree to which this is just Netanyahu trying to stay in office, trying to stay out of jail, trying to do political deals. And he made the point, I was asking about annexation of the West Bank, whether that is likely to happen this year with the blessing of the Trump administration. He thinks that most likely it actually will not happen, but that it may. And, again, he made the point, which many other Israelis have, that if Israel does annex the West Bank, that, it will not allow Palestinians to vote, because that would, at that point, it wouldn't be a Jewish state, or it wouldn't be a democracy. And that, at that point, if you don't let Palestinians vote, then you've lost all the goals of Zionism that led to the creation of Israel. You've created this, this two-tier state, and you lost that idealism that was so profound at the establishment of Israel.
And over half the people that live between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea at this point are not Jewish. And so, Barak has always said, and a lot of us have said, you have a choice. You can either be a democracy and give everybody the vote. If there's only one state, if you give them the vote, then it's no longer going to be Jewish in character. Or you deny more than half the population political rights, and it's no longer a democracy. And that's the choice that is being forced on not only the state of Israel, but Jewish people around the world who care about Israel. Because if you don't divide the land and have a border and create a Palestinian state, there's no way for Israel to be both Jewish and a democracy. And it really is the end of the Zionist dream.
So I have a question for you, actually. One thing I one thing I wonder, journalists are good at turning tables on people. So, it's harder and harder to see a two-state solution coming forward. I certainly don't believe in a one-state solution. I think the last best hope is a two-state solution, but I have a very hard time seeing how we get there. And I've sometimes wondered whether people like me should push for immediate voting rights of Palestinians in the West Bank on the argument that, look, you can't delay this forever. If you're not going to create a Palestinian state in the West Bank, then in the meantime, give Palestinians there the same voting rights that settlers have. Just as a way of trying to kind of raise this issue, this fundamental inequity. I'm curious what you think of, that as a point of advocacy.
Well, I think a lot of folks in the human rights community involved in this conflict from that point of view have gone there, right? They've given up on the concept of there being a political resolution, and therefore it becomes just a matter of legal rights. I'm still hanging in there on the political resolution, and our take on it is really the need to reframe the two-state solution, that the two-state solution as a phrase and as a frame and as a something to get people excited about it, it's over, right? You can't get people to think positively about that. So we've started to frame it as a 23-state solution, that it actually is a regional solution. And what's on offer for Israel is the full acceptance of the state of Israel into its entire neighborhood, and recognition and relationships and embassies and deals with every one of its neighbors. And so there's a lot more on offer for Israelis than simply you give up some land and you get a Palestinian state. What's on offer is actually the culmination of the founding of the state of Israel in 1948. This is the culminating dream. You've been accepted. Your borders are now recognized. The whole world now recognizes the state of Israel. So thinking about it that way, that you're trading off the joint investment by the whole region in the creation of a successful Palestinian state for Israel's acceptance into the whole region, creates a whole different framework to think about the resolution of the problem. And I think, we can change post Netanyahu, which is, a key factor here. But the government after him really will have that opportunity because the Saudis and others really want that. And they're saying they won't do it without there being a Palestinian state. I think there's still a pathway forward, but it's not going to be in the two-state framework. It's going to be in the context of this broader normalization. And so we've started calling it a 23-state solution. What do you think?
I do think that's a much more palatable framework. I've got to say, I still think I'm still somewhat skeptical that will end up happening. I think Israel, as you know, is just so shattered by the Hamas attack. I think Hamas managed to pretty much destroy the Israeli center left that was the natural constituency for this. But you're right. Times change, and there will be at some point a new leader. This makes sense for Israel. And we've got to. I've seen in my career, I've seen things that were much less likely than that happen because people fought for them, because people pushed for them, because people had that vision of what might happen, and by pushing for it, they made it actually come about.
And I think it's not going to be, the center left anymore. It's going to be the center right that, sees the opportunity of security deals, of economic deals with the entire region, and knows they can never get there. They're going to live as a little isolated state without normal relations with all their neighbors unless they do this step. And so I think it's going to be the folks on the center right that actually lead the way for practical national security, national interest reasons, rather than the kind of moral reasons and the humanitarian reasons that, some of us on the more left of things might have, hoped. But, I liked your description. I think you wrote that the people are caught between the irreconcilable demands of the two parties that end up showing brutal indifference both to the Palestinian people and to the hostages. And they just have these, we can't see a way between Hamas and Netanyahu to get out of this bind. And who's suffering? The people. And we've got to break that. And that is that challenge. Well, that is only one challenge that you have addressed over the course of these recent weeks. You then, I think, either before or after, were traveling through Africa and really looking firsthand at the impact of what this Trump administration is doing in the destruction of USAID and of America's role in the world. And you wrote some wonderful and moving columns. And I'm just wondering if now it's been a few weeks and a few months since a couple of those columns, what reflections you have now that we're 90 days into all of this about what the destruction of this aspect of American foreign policy is doing to the people that you ran into.
It's one of the toughest things as a reporter to go to these places is when you see children starving. And I think that's because when a child is starving to death, it doesn't cry, it doesn't weep, it doesn't, struggle for food. It just shuts down like a zombie, is expressionless because every calorie is going to keep the major organs alive. And so you see these emaciated children, and they just look, their eyes follow you, and you know that they're dying, and they they have shut down. And I saw children like that in South Sudan that had been part of a program that provided these emergency food rations to this community. And then because of USAID's shutdown, that program ended, and these children were now starving. And I went to a program to a clinic that had started, and it was the first one in the area to provide help for moms in childbirth. It was an area where maternal mortality had been extremely high, and this clinic had opened up, I think, in November. And since then, not one mom had died in childbirth, not one baby had died. And I show up, and I'm this white guy who shows up at this clinic asking questions, and everybody is like, turns out, and they think somehow I'm responsible for bringing this clinic there, and they're cheering me, they're thanking America, they're saying how much it has helped women in the area. There's a woman who is then in labor, and she wants to name her baby after me as a tribute, as a way of saying thank you. And what they don't know is that because of the USAID shutdown, that clinic actually was about to close, and women were going to go back to bleeding in the dust and dying. And you just saw this all over. And their PEPFAR is one of the greatest programs in America in my lifetime. It has saved 26 million people around the world from HIV/AIDS. And in theory, it is going to be sustained under President Trump, but in practice, it it was disintegrating. And so within Elon Musk had said, "Oh, nobody is dying from this," and in fact, right away, I came across a 10-year-old boy, a 8-year-old girl, and a 5-year-old boy who had died from from the shutdown. Can I show you a picture of this 5-year-old boy? His name is Evan Anzo, and he had he was an orphan, and there was a health worker who was bringing him the ARV medicines, and that's Evan. And 5-year-old boy, we were keeping him alive for 12 cents a day with ARVs. And then we stopped, and Evan is now dead. Just breaks your heart.
Yeah, no, I think you wrote, and I saw that was dated March 15th, and I think it was your March 15 column where you said at the end of the day, millions of people could die as a result of these cuts. I mean, and the callousness with which Elon Musk and this team are approaching this is inhuman. And it really speaks to the worst of us, not, what we hoped American values would be in an American role in the world.
Musk said something about how the greatest weakness of Western civilization was empathy. And I think it's an incredible resource, and empathy is not enough. You need to, we've seen plenty of mistakes where people with the best of intentions screwed things up. But empathy armored with intelligence about what works, how to make a difference, is transformative. It's the reason we were able to overcome slavery, to lift billions of people out of poverty. And that empathy, there's an empathy vacuum in the White House right now, I'm afraid.
And empathy, by the way, I mean, not to go back to Israel, Palestine, but it's the lack of empathy for the other that fuels conflicts like this. It's the inability of Palestinians to understand the fear and insecurity that Jews and Israelis have in their history, and from things like October 7th, and it's the inability of the Israeli population, the Jewish population, to understand what's happening in Gaza and what Palestinian life under occupation has been like. It's this lack of empathy, the blank, flat screen of the other and not seeing the human on the other side of it, that I think fuels these conflicts and makes it impossible to resolve them.
I think that's right. And historically, whenever we've been afraid, our empathy has dropped. And, that was true in World War II when we interned Japanese Americans. It's been true at every point for every people. And after October 7th, Israeli Jews were afraid, and understandably, their empathy collapsed. And Palestinians living in desperate conditions, their empathy collapsed too. And so, boy, that is not encouraging for the direction of the Middle East, I've got to say.
Yeah. And you come then back to this country and begin to also explore the question of empathy in our domestic politics, right? I mean, it's also a direct line to some explanation of what goes on here, right? Because the fear factor that Trump and the MAGA movement are playing into about the other within society is what then is allowing them to fuel the immigration crackdown and this sense of we're rounding up people who are all gang members, and there's no empathy, there's no attempt to understand the man who was taken, who is a father and has a wife who's a citizen and three kids who are growing up in the community, and he has a job and he coaches a baseball team, and it's that lack of ability to see the human in the other.
I think that's exactly right, but I would even argue that that's true in a larger framework. If you think about the United States over historical times, then we led the world in education until the 1970s. We were roughly on par with other countries in health outcomes until the early 1970s. We had incarceration rates that were similar to other countries until that period. And then after about 1975, suddenly so much changed. Other countries expanded healthcare, and life expectancy improved for other countries much more than for the U.S. Our high school graduation rates stalled. In other countries, they improved. Incarceration rates rose sevenfold. And I've often wondered, what was it about the 1970s that led us to go on a different path? And I think that, in many ways, it was a certain amount of fear coupled with racism, fear of the other, and, concern about the violence of both street unrest and about crime that led people to become more racist, led people not to want to invest in the human capital of people of color, but in ways that also meant less investment in human capital of low-income white populations, in ways that I think set our whole country back and have undermined its future. And then what is happening recently is absolutely another manifestation of that, I believe.
Right. Well, let's dig into that, because you've got an audience here, several hundred, many hundreds of folks who are watching, and obviously they're probably almost all New York Times readers, and they probably all fall into a certain demographic of, education, thoughtfulness, et cetera. And I love the fact, and you called it, I think, the Bewildered Liberals Book Club that you're establishing to help this demographic to grasp how it is that the fears that we've just been discussing and the inherent desire to view the world through a very simplistic us versus them lens, how that's being manipulated by people who don't have their best interests at heart. Most of the liberals that I know in the New York Times reading audience just can't understand, can't fathom how it is that folks who are going to be hurt by what this president is doing have been manipulated in this kind of a way, and how you've tried to explain it in so many of your columns. Your book really digs into this, But here you've got another opportunity to help people to understand what is it that is motivating the base of people that have decided against their own, logical interest that we might read to vote for this kind of a regime.
So any insight I have in this rests upon the fact that I grew up in and live in this small town in rural Oregon, Yamhill, that historically had done pretty well with agriculture, timber, and light manufacturing. And then, as in so much of working class America, those jobs went away and meth arrived and people began to die. And so at this point, Jeremy, more than a third of the kids on my old number 6 high school bus are gone from drugs, alcohol, and suicide. The girl who was my 7th grade crush, Mary, is a very strong Trump supporter. And, why is that? Mary is this very good person. And she's smart. But she spent 7 years homeless because of alcoholism, and she got married right after high school. She never went to college, was in a very, very violent relationship. She self-medicated. That led her to be homeless for 7 years. And then a local evangelical church effectively helped her when she was homeless and lifted her up. And she 4 relatives in her family killed themselves. Mary herself once put a gun to her head and thought about it. And she just feels that elites betrayed her and all of working class America. She's not entirely wrong. She thinks that these elites, and sort of scare quotes, look down on her faith. She's not entirely wrong. And then she hears Trump talk about how he's going to bring back factory jobs. And he points to scapegoats about, immigrants taking jobs from people like you. And there's this natural hope, I think, in anybody that we can fix these things, and we can go back to some economic situation that is better. And, I think you multiply Mary by millions, and you have one factor in the election of Trump. And, I think the fact that there were growing numbers of working class Latinos and African Americans who voted for Trump reflects the degree to which this did involve class. I think that we liberals are very good at understanding disadvantage that is rooted in race. I think we are much less clear about understanding disadvantage that is rooted in class. And of course, race and class often go together. There are a lot of African American folks who are also suffer the disadvantage simultaneously of race and class in America, and sometimes of gender too. But I think that it's the gaps in America, 8-year difference in life expectancy between a high school dropout and a college graduate, suicide rates just off the charts, men in particular floundering, family structure collapsing for high school dropouts. That world has just unraveled, and people are much more willing to turn to a charlatan who's going to promise some improvement.
Right. And if we don't figure out how to address that, and if we, being folks who want to electorally win and change the direction that the country's headed in, if we don't figure that out, then all of the litany of disasters that you catalog, whether it's foreign or domestic, whether it relates to Israel, whether it relates to Africa, or it relates to rural Oregon, that whole litany of stuff will never be addressed if we don't understand how to win an election. And we're not going to
Win an
win.
election, not in New York or in Portland, but in, say, Wisconsin or Arizona or Nevada. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. And, I think that's where some of the things that you write are of the most importance to those of us who are trying to sort our way through this moment and to think, well, how do we actually make the case? And it's not going to be necessarily by, the wonderful boy that you showed the photo of, that's not going to be the, topic that's going to move that voter that we need, right? It's going to be, are we offering that empathy to the very voters that feel left behind by the elites that we represent, and that I think is at the nub of the political problem that the Democrats have at the moment and need to fix. And we need to fix it both in message and messenger.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the dangers for Democrats right now is that they're so outraged at everything Trump is doing that they sort of rush out and that they emerge and appear to be defenders of a status quo that people just don't like. We have to figure out a way of navigating that difference so that we prevent Mr. Rodrigo Garcia from being held in a Salvadoran prison forever, and yet not, appear to be defending a status quo that is wildly unpopular. I think we also need to avoid having Trump push us to the left and toward unpopular positions. I felt that in Trump's first term, frankly, Trump did push me and millions of liberals to the left. And when he uh, broke families apart to kids from parents at the border, I just wanted to, welcome every immigrant imaginable. It was so outrageous. And yet, while tearing families apart was unpopular, so was the idea of opening borders more broadly. And so we have to, you know, we have to listen to people and maybe do a little bit less, finger wagging and talking to people. And I think it was a huge mistake when a lot of liberals ended up trying to cast every Trump voter as a racist and a bigot. I think we should be really careful of, broad stereotypes. And it's also pretty hard to win votes from people that you're calling racists and bigots.
Well, and it leads me then to, today's column in which you highlighted what's happening to our university system and particularly to Harvard. It's almost as if this was, pre-scripted, right? By if you were going to try to appeal to folks who don't like elites, what would be one of the first things you'd go after? You'd target the billions of dollars at Harvard, right? I mean, it's just playing right from that playbook. And so again, it outrages every one of us who has been through those institutions and who reads your columns and subscribes to the New York Times and plays Wordle every morning. But what do we do to not look like the defenders of the elite establishment, and yet at the same time stand up for what is so important about these institutions of higher education and the research that they do and the good they do for society? How do you make that connection while defending those institutions that people don't have the highest regard for?
So I don't think that educated liberals understand the degree to which they are perceived as condescending and patronizing to working class Americans. And for example, it's routine in our world for people to attach their pronouns to an email, to in a meeting, to offer their pronouns, and we do this because we see this as being inclusive. Um, and in our world, it is inclusive. But if you don't live in the world of words, if you don't live in this ecosystem, then it's not inclusive. It's scary. It's different. You don't know what this means. And it ends up being excluding people, excluding working class people who don't really understand the point and what is going on. And so we have to just we have I think we just have to bear in mind that it's a complicated world. People come at it from different ways. Yeah, I suspect some folks will profoundly disagree with this, but I think that one of our mistakes, not just in America, but in Europe and Canada, was that we didn't listen to voters enough about immigration. And look, I'm the son of a refugee. I think refugees strengthen us. I think immigration strengthens us. But I also think that when about 15% of a population is immigrant, then historically and around the world, voters have rebelled. And I think that in Europe and in America, voters repeatedly said, you know, that's kind of, we want to slow things down. And we didn't listen. And the upshot is that we are now seeing that angry voters elected Trump, and we are now seeing this brutal crackdown that is incredibly offensive to our values. And again, I don't have easy answers about how we navigate things we deeply believe in with voter sentiment that is in a different direction. But I think we have to do some listening, and that has to be constantly in our minds.
Yeah,
Now I've just offended a bunch of viewers here, probably.
yeah, no, look, I'm watching some of the comments in the Q&A and the chat, and it definitely is very hard, I think, for the core audience that's you're speaking to right now, and who reads your column, and many people who vote consistently Democratic. It is very hard to think about what it is on the other side of that window that you're opening up. You're opening up a window and helping us to understand what is resonating, what is motivating people. And if we don't understand that, we're never going to be able to reach them. And we're never going to be able to bring them along politically to where we might then hope them to be, and not be voting for a racist and a charlatan and somebody's blowing up the greatest institutions of our country, and everything that makes our, I think today you said, everything that makes, in fact, our country great is being blown apart, right? We have to defend our greatness, you said, from this man in the White House who's destroying it. And if we don't understand why it is that people voted for him, then we're never going to be able to address their concerns and move them over to the other side of the column. And I think that's what you're doing, is you're opening up that window, inviting us to listen and to see. And some of it may be uncomfortable, but I think it's a really important part of journalism.
And I think we have to remember that economic issues for many people are paramount. And I think whether it's the price of eggs or anything else, that is just enormously motivating. And it just broke my heart when voters said that they trusted Trump and Republicans more on economic issues than Democrats, who, from my point of view, had a much, much sounder economic plan. But you can't implement economic plans if you can't convince voters of that. And, we lost, and in states like Wisconsin, like Ohio. I mean, Sherrod Brown, I think, from Ohio, was very, very good at making this argument. And he significantly outperformed Kamala Harris, but he still lost. And I think a lot of that was people just fed up at economic situation, at being told that the economy was great when they didn't feel that way, and at a status quo that they felt that Democrats were defending and representing.
Right. And it's impossible for us to process. I mean, I certainly find it impossible to process that the president of the United States, who's doing what he's doing, has a higher approval rating than the Democratic Party. I mean, how is that possible? And yet that is the situation, the lowest, I think, favorability that's ever been recorded for the Democratic Party right now. Yet it's the Republican Party and the president that's doing this to the country. So this disconnect, we're just going to have to really try to process this information and learn from this. You and I talked a little bit just as we were about to sign on about, where we head, right? If now we're on this path where this out of control authoritarian executive is trampling. I mean, Congress has just gotten out of the way, so he's not really trampling because they've invited him to take their power and they're ceding it gladly. But now the courts stand in the way, and we're really right at that moment of truth where courts are going to be telling him you can't do certain things and going to try to hold some of those officials in contempt, and then they're going to reject the court order. And we asked, a couple of people have asked in the Q&A what your thought is about what happens when we get to that moment. What happens when Trump refuses to comply with a direct Supreme Court order? What's the answer in other situations that you've reported on around the world where authoritarianism is on the rise and the people do rise up and fight it? What are the things we can learn from other societies?
I think the Supreme Court is thinking about, what happens if we issue an order and Trump ignores it? And does that suggest the weakness of the court? And, that's got to be a consideration. But I'd also note that with Brown versus Board of Education, that was largely ignored by much of the country. It took years and years to actually desegregate schools around the country. And yet that would not have been an argument against offering that unanimous judgment, that unanimous ruling in Brown versus Board. It was an important ruling, even though it took time to take effect. I guess I'd also say that the lessons from around the world, I've spent much of my career covering authoritarianism in other countries, Jeremy. Now I'm covering authoritarianism at home. And I think one lesson is that, educated world and intellectuals, that the natural response to an authoritarian is to say, but rights are important and, we need democracy. And that tends not to resonate very deeply. Yeah, President Bukele from El Salvador, who just came, he is very, very popular, genuinely very popular in El Salvador, even though he has completely undermined democracy in that country because he improved public safety. And so I think we have to recognize that while democracy is an enormously important value, that advocacy based on democracy isn't always so effective. So what is effective? I think that the economic arguments are that, Trump is increasing inflation, that the tariffs are one of the biggest tax cuts in history. I think also that arguments about corruption are enormously powerful, that people don't like the idea of a leader monetizing that office. I think that is very powerful. I think also the idea that a leader is manipulating the public and doesn't really respect them, but is just kind of messing with them. I think that has tended to be a very effective argument in other countries, in a different world, but there's been a lot of research on what gets teenagers to avoid smoking, not to begin smoking. And all the warnings about public health, this is going to kill you from lung cancer, they are completely ineffective. What does work is warning that tobacco companies are manipulating kids like you to get you to smoke. And I think there's something parallel in the electoral world. And finally, the last lesson, I think, is the power of humor and mockery. And that, in Serbia in particular, efforts to poke fun of a ruler, of his sanctimony, his self-importance, his misrule, that those were really, really quite effective in getting people to laugh at a leader. And once they laughed at him, then to rise up against him. And Trump is certainly giving us plenty of fodder in that department.
So let me just make a couple of quick announcements to folks. We've got about 10, 15 minutes left for some questions. I see basically everybody who's online has asked a question, so I know that I won't get to them all. But I do want to suggest perhaps Eliza could put into the chat your just a link to where you have all of your op-eds under your name on the New York Times. And I think, so much of what we've been discussing, you articulate over the course of the last few months on all of these issues so well. And I just, in preparing for this, I so enjoyed just reading them serially. And, all together, it comes into play as a coherent politics and a coherent worldview. And so thank you for that. The other thing I would just ask for folks is for Eliza to put into the chat a link to my Substack, because a lot of what we're discussing here, I'm also exploring on Substack, which is a great medium for me to be able to just express myself in words. And so hopefully that is a place where we can host this chat as well and continue some of the dialogue there. One of the topics I've been addressing, and you and I talked a little bit about this just as we were getting on, is the question of anti-Semitism and the way that Trump is using the fight, very, very important and legitimate fight against anti-Semitism, which is a plague across the centuries and across the millennia, just like all forms of hate and bigotry. Anti-Semitism does have a special place in all of that, but it's been there for a long time and it's legitimate to fight it. But it's being used in a very specific way by this administration to do so much of its agenda. I mean, did you see that one? Did you have that on your bingo card, that this was going to be the tool in the toolkit that was going to open up the immigration and the higher ed and the rule of law? All of these fights are being done through a lens of fighting anti-Semitism.
Yeah, I mean, I've been surprised by a couple of things. I must say that after October 7th, I was surprised by how much anti-Semitism seemed to lurk in the left. I had always kind of thought of anti-Semitism as, what these white nationalists do. And it became, and I mean, obviously I, hugely disapproved of what's going on in Gaza. And I certainly don't think that critiques of what Israel is doing in Gaza reflect anti-Semitism. But I also thought that there really was some genuine, outbursts that were fundamentally anti-Semitic. And then, but then to see the Trump administration, then, and note that the Trump administration is home to so many folks who exhibit precisely the anti-Semitism that they're busy denouncing on campuses. And, President Trump himself has said all these pretty dubious things about the Jewish community. For them to use this as a way to go after, to cut off funding for research into cancer, into heart disease, into diabetes at Harvard, to try to destroy universities. And, one of the things I've seen authoritarian regimes do all over the world is you go after universities. They're a potential alternative source of ideas, of influence, and so you crush them. That's what Trump is doing, and it has nothing to do with anti-Semitism. And if he's trying to address anti-Semitism, great, but raise that at a cabinet meeting, for God's sake. What is your take?
Yeah, no, look, I think that he is absolutely manipulating the worst fears of people on these issues for his political gain. And it's just amazing that, as you said, it's a group of people with deep roots into anti-Semitic movements and willing to embrace white nationalists who really do carry guns into synagogues and shoot people. I mean, that is the world on that side of the equation. And somehow the fear that is within the Jewish community of these protests and the people who are screaming at them over what's happening in Israel, sometimes in very, very unacceptable and inappropriate ways, but that fear is so deep that they've been taken in by this charlatan, who is selling them the medicine that somehow, well, then shutting down the university or kicking 1,000 and more students out of the country is the way to address this. It pains me deeply. The Jewish experience is one rooted in immigration and education and the rule of law. Those are three pillars of the success of the Jewish people in this country. And those are the three pillars that are being addressed in the name of our people. And something about that is deeply and fundamentally wrong.
Goes back to the point about fear that we raised earlier.
It's so powerful. A couple of questions have come up in the chat about your take on what Bernie Sanders and AOC are doing, because if you listen to what you and I are saying about the need to have an economic agenda, to listen to the economic problems, the situation that the center of the country is really feeling, the center of our population isn't Bernie and AOC, aren't they showing us the way? And I'm curious what your take on that is.
So, to some degree, I mean, I think Bernie is better at this than AOC is in terms of, what resonates in places like Ohio. Um, but I think that, that populist economic message, I think goes a long way. The warnings about corruption. Yeah, so I think there's a lot to learn from them and from their success.
Does oligarchy, is that a word that would you put that on the platform? Is that the word you would use? Because I think that's what their tour
Yeah.
is.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
mean, giving a little bit of license, a political license to them. I mean, I think that's a word that really resonates, and there is this sense, again, not entirely wrong, that large corporations are out of control and they have complete license to do what they will with people, and there's some truth to that, and I think that that goes over very well. I mean, I think that one of Trump's weaknesses is Elon Musk, that even people who are sympathetic to Trump are pretty skeptical about the idea of the richest man in the world using his presence in the White House to advantage himself. And so, yeah, so, all that I think is pretty good messaging.
Yeah, no, and I think that, certainly if I'm judging by the themes that are coming up in the chat here, that is something that this group certainly can relate to. But I think there's also the danger at the same time in the economic populism message, you do see some of the cultural issues raised. And I think that's where we have to be really careful, right? I mean, I think that the line between being sort of feisty and fighting on oligarchy and corruption and income and wealth inequality and the corruption of the corporate structure. But then when it crosses into some of the social issues, I think is when the more left of our politics begins to lose the center.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, look, I think that, and I think Trump has a real vulnerability because I think the conversation in the coming months will increasingly be about Medicaid, which 70 million Americans rely on, 40% of the country's children, and Social Security, which is another just, central pillar of the country. I think Republicans are probably making a real political mistake by going after them to pay for tax cuts that disproportionately will benefit the rich. So as long as the national conversation is about Medicaid or Social Security or healthcare more broadly, or about cost of living, about big corporations, I think that Democrats benefit. I think if the conversation is about immigration, public safety on the streets, then Trump is more likely to benefit. And so that doesn't mean that we shrink from conversations about Mr. Abrego Garcia and what has been done to his family, but we also can't make it just about immigrants being treated terribly. We also have to, acknowledge the importance of these other issues like inflation, and like the recession that we may already have entered, and healthcare.
And just a final couple of questions for you, and I know we need to wrap things up. The Supreme Court, I think we almost got to the answer on this one, but what is your sense of what the reaction in the streets needs to be? I mean, what is you talked a bit about some of the tactics that have worked in terms of humor and the type of messaging and things that have worked in other countries. But if the Supreme Court's orders are defied by a president of the United States, what does this half of the country do?
I'm not sure. I think that there at that point, that if I think that John Roberts, you know, is a pretty savvy politician. I think that he will work very, very hard to get a unanimous judgment out, as the previous unsigned order was apparently unanimous. I think that he will try to have it be unanimous. And I think that it is striking that you have Judge Boasberg, originally appointed by George W. Bush, who is now investigating the administration for criminal contempt of court. You had Judge Harvey Wilkinson, one of the leading conservative judges in the country, who wrote an opinion in the case talking about how the administration is on a path of lawlessness. So, and going after Perkins Coie in that way, and suggesting that this major law firm would basically be destroyed unless it, completely caved. And I think that even conservative judges feel this is beyond the pale. So I think we're quite likely to get, I hope, a unanimous decision out of the Supreme Court, or close to unanimous. And I think if the administration completely mocked it, I think that would really hurt it politically. I think it would hurt it in the House. I think House members are thinking about their next elections. But what one does at that point, I don't know. I'll have to think about that before I actually venture a column in print.
All right, well, I look forward to that, and I know that our audience does as well, and we deeply value and cherish all that you write and the inspiration and the challenge that you put before us. And thank you for the role that you play in American democracy right now. It's a very important role.
Well, thank you, Jeremy, and just thanks to all your members that, at a time when empathy seems to be pretty rare and hard to find, then J Street, I think, exemplifies the power of that empathy, and it's just kind of like a lighthouse in a storm around there. So keep that light blazing, okay?
We will, absolutely. Thank you so much. Really appreciate it. Look forward to the next time.
Absolutely. Take care.
Everyone.